session of our webinar. So today we welcome Clements. She is a globally recognized children's rights advocate, author, and speaker. She's the co-founder of Riverstone Village, a Sudbury-style democratic school in South Africa, and a founder member of the Rights-Centric Education Network. She's also served on the Oversight Committee of the European Democratic Education Community, or EUDEC, and has advised several democratic schools around the world. So today she will talk about and explore education and inculturation and why nurturing a culture of peace and education is essential, and how schools can empower all children, including those who need to be in a more inclusive environment.
Thanks so much, Baran. Can everybody see my slides?
I can see it, yes.
Lovely. So at the end of the presentation, I'll be sharing why I chose this particular image of an ancient grinding stone or quern that's used for turning grain into something more digestible and nourishing. But that should already be giving us a clue. So this is what I want to talk about today. I've made a little list of key points because I'm going to be going through these, and as I say, it'll take a little while for them to add up. So first of all, what is inculturation with an I? Because that is something particular. And then I want to look at what are finite and infinite games. I'll explain why I'm going there. Then what kind of games are war and peace? Why do we need to center human rights and well-being? Once we've laid that foundation, we'll be able to have a look at what kind of game is education. And then we can go into how did we actually get our current dominant schooling model that's the most common around the globe, and why it is now so important to achieve a culture of peace in school environments. And also why it is so hard to achieve a culture of peace in school environments. To answer that, we'll have to look at what is inculturation with an E and what is acculturation with an A. And that will take us into how we actually can achieve a culture of peace in school environments and what that can do for humans of all ages, children, parents, teachers, staff, who have diverse needs. And that will finally lead us to my proposal that we actually start looking for inculturation with a Y. What on earth do I mean by that? So now let's dive into our first point. What is inculturation with an I? So this is actually a religious theological term, and it refers to taking a religion as it stands and then wanting to put this religion into a new community, into a new context. So the beliefs and practices are adapted and changed to fit a new context, to embody and transmit the key values without losing anything from the original religion. To put it more simply, inculturation takes the main ideas of a religion and turns them into ways of doing things that make sense in a new place while keeping the main lessons the same. So you can see here in this picture, this is actually a Catholic mass, and it looks very, very different than something you would have seen or even now see in the Vatican, because this is taking place in Zaire. So you actually have little girls here dancing with their fly whisks in a rhythmic way, and people circling the altar. Yet this is still a Catholic mass. It looks completely different because it's been adapted to fit the culture in Zaire. So the form changes, but the meaning and the values stay the same. That is what inculturation is. Now, these days, we can look at this in a happy way as a matter of mutual respect and dialogue to say that local cultures are valuable in their own right. However, that's not how inculturation began. Inculturation began as a strategic method to embed a religion's belief, values, and worldview and behavioral patterns into as many different contexts as possible. And that was for purposes of missionary expansion and evangelization, which came along with colonialism. Okay, so that's what inculturation is. Now I'm going to jump completely sideways to a concept that was actually, this is actually a theologian, James Carse, a Christian theologian. And he started looking at game theory, and he came up with the idea of finite and infinite games as part of his way to explain the difference between what he saw as good and what he saw as evil. He said, it's either a finite or an infinite game. A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, and it has an end. You have a winner and a loser. If you think of the game of chess, you know when it's over, and there's a winner and there's a loser. Whereas an infinite game is a game for the purpose of continuing to play. So another example would be a job interview is a finite game. You'll either get the job or you won't, and the interview will be over. But your career is an infinite game that you want to keep playing and progressing. So therefore, finite games can be played within an infinite game. You can have many job interviews in the course of your career, but an infinite game cannot be played inside a finite game. You can't have a whole career inside a job interview. And when people are playing infinitely, they regard their wins and losses in whatever finite game they are playing as but moments in continuing play. And this is also what we call the growth mindset. We don't let the little wins or the little losses impact us too much, because the point is the bigger picture. This is also where the idea of good sportsmanship comes in. When we play a finite game as if it's just a finite game, we can be very rude to the person who beats us, for example, or very rude to the person we managed to beat. And in that way, we sacrifice the infinite game because we lose the opportunity to play with them again. They won't want to play with us anymore. And you'll see this concept coming through in the work of Dr. Peter Gray when he looks at children and the way that they play naturally, that they tend to play in order to be able to play with the same children again, whatever finite games they happen to be playing together. So what kinds of games are war and peace? Because James Carse spoke about this quite directly, and he said that war is the ultimate finite game, that war is the ultimate expression of the finite game. You always want the war to end, and you want to be the winner at the end of the war, and it can be at whatever cost to your opponent, which we can see happening in the world right now. And he said, evil does exist. It is when an infinite game is absorbed utterly in a finite game. What he meant by this, for example, when he was talking about theology, is he said that when your religion becomes just an ideology, then that is when you start making war for religious purposes or persecuting people for religious reasons. When your religion or your spirituality is still played as an infinite game, you know that there is always something more for you to learn. So you have more of an attitude of humility, that your belief can expand and grow and become more nuanced. It is only when you collapse that belief into a dogma that you are then become inflexible. You don't believe there's anything for you to learn. And now you can justify doing things, horrific things, in the name of love. The infinite game must always be more important and have a far higher value than the finite game. When the finite game becomes more important than the infinite game, that's when you get violence and things go wrong. So when we center human rights and well-being, it gives us a very definite, clear kind of quality control to make sure that we are going for the sort of peace that's good for everybody, rather than just a kind of a domination that is only going to benefit the strongest person in the room. What kind of game is education? Training is a finite game. You do it for this long, then it's over, and you either pass or you fail. You either, for example, get your trade certificate or you don't. Whereas education, he said, is an infinite game. This is about growing and developing and becoming more capable and more of yourself as life goes on for your whole life. Education is a lifelong journey. So when we look at schooling, which one are we going to prioritize? Are we going to crush education into a finite game of training? Or are we going to make sure that training always stays as bits and pieces that we do during the course of our education? Which way round are we going to do this? And what are the consequences going to be in terms of a culture of peace? Some lovely quotes directly from James Carse about the difference, to try and really get our heads into the difference of why he says one is the finite game and one is the infinite game. To be prepared against surprise is to be trained. To be prepared for surprise is to be educated. Education discovers an increasing richness in the past because it sees what is unfinished there, whereas training regards the past as finished and the future as to be finished. Education leads towards a continuing self-discovery, whereas training leads towards a final self-definition. Am I a doctor? Am I a plumber? Or am I a human being and becoming? He goes on to say, training repeats a completed past in the future. We tell people how to do the same thing we've already figured out how to do again and again and again. Whereas education continues an unfinished past into the future. We can always innovate, we can always grow, we can always improve. And this is really interesting. He says the most critical distinction between finite and infinite games is that the rules of an infinite game must change during the course of play. Obviously, the rules during training or during a finite game like chess, you don't want to change the rules in the middle of the play. That destroys a finite game. But for infinite games, he says they must change. Why and when? They change when the players of an infinite game agree that the play is imperiled by a finite outcome that seems to be impending. That is by the victory or defeat of some of the players. So when you are in an infinite game together and you want to continue playing, you don't want anybody to win or lose, because only when everybody continues to be included, then you have that individual and communal win-win. You have sustainability. Now let's notice what our world is doing right now, just on a concrete level. We're treating, for example, economics as a finite game that can be won, and the infinite game of sustainability is the one we want to start playing so that economics doesn't kill our planet and make us extinct. So we change the rules so that nobody loses, nobody has to leave the game. It's inclusive. And so we start seeing here how this is so tied up with a culture of true peace. Finally, for now, and he's got a lot of other things to say, but I'm going to keep it contained. Lovely quote is that finite players play within boundaries, whereas infinite players play with boundaries. We can really see this when we look at progressive forms of education. What they're doing is they're playing with boundaries, and they're responding to the young people who are in that form of education, continually refining the practice in order to become more and more inclusive and more capable of seeding and nurturing that culture of peace. I wanted to see what about this exact model here, because to me, these are the three things that distinguish the current dominant model in the world. There's coerced compliance. It's compulsory, and you don't have a choice about what you do even once you're in the classroom. You have to do what you're told to do. There's competitive assessment that you don't have a choice about. You will be graded compared to your neighbor, and there will be children ranked higher than you and lower than you, and some of them will get prizes, and some of them will fail, and some of them will get behavior prizes, and some of them will be expelled. And there are age-segregated cohorts. The 6-year-olds get started, and then in grade 2, they go to, at the age of 7, they go to grade 2, and so on. They are age-segregated. And these three characteristics of the system don't exist in all schooling models, but the combination of these three exist in the dominant model in all its different forms, in all of its different inculturations around the world. So I wanted to know, who were the first people to do this? When did it start happening? Why did it start happening? And so I went on a deep dive. And here is what I was looking for. I was looking for signs of the finite game, that there's definite endings to schooling. You enter here and you leave here, that there are fixed training parameters determining the winners and losers, because that's the only way you can really have competition. If everybody's competing fairly for the same outcomes, there's rewards and punishments, keeping them on track with the prescribed curriculum and code of conduct, which is how that compliance gets coerced. And systems where you have to play within these boundaries, and these three rules can't be changed. And as I went on this deep dive, I started to get a sense of something, and I started to get a hypothesis. I hypothesized that this specific combination of these three was first seeded for colonial and missionary purposes, and then completed specifically for military purposes, making it exactly the opposite of a schooling system that is optimized for peace. It was specifically designed for the benefit of domination and war. I first see it in the mid-1500s. They developed something called the Ratio Studorum, the Jesuits, in their own colleges, which was competitive. And there were prizes and public gradings, and they were pitted against each other. But there wasn't yet coerced attendance, and they weren't age segregating. You came into the system when you did, and you competed against the people who were there with you. Then compulsory schooling starts in Prussia in 1717, and it's definitely a tool of political control. It's definitely intended to instill obedience and conformity. There's heavy religious indoctrination motivations into it, and patriotism to support the state's military and bureaucratic needs, but it's not yet competitively graded, and it's not yet age segregated. And then the first combination of the two comes in colonial contexts, where they were pushing the indigenous children into school and forcing them to compete against each other with grading systems. And this was for indigenous populations who were being colonized. And in some contexts, this was happening in the 1500s to 1600s with Jesuit and other mission schools in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. And this predates this kind of thing happening in home territories. In terms of the combination of the two, it predates home territory what I call C-squared schooling, by like 100 to 150 years. And when you add in competitive schooling in home territories, it's like more than 300 years later. So this starts in the colonies specifically, right? Because it wasn't primarily meant to be educational. If you look at the history of some of residential schools, for example, they basically just taught religion and obedience. It was intended as a subtle mechanism of inculturation, or not so subtle. And if we look at the idea of encoding the religion into a new form that is this type of school, a single truth is revealed to a chosen people, which is then codified by a hierarchical authority, framing children and indigenous people as inherently bestial or in a state of original sin, in need of salvation through schooling, with ultimate reward. A grade, straight to A grades is a kind of heaven that you get at the end, attainable only through obedient compliance with the school's competitive hierarchy, which imitates very closely the religious model that they were also inculturating these people into at the time. This had a wonderful advantage for the colonizers because it made the people easier to control, and it selected a small group of individuals who could then be elevated and receive privileges to become the intermediaries and local enforcers, while the rest would be converted into trained labor for extractivist purposes, while being indoctrinated to see their misery as an expression of their own unworthiness, rather than as a result of systematic oppression. Then the final component that took it from being C squared to C cubed is the age-segregated cohort. Now, when did this come in? I was very curious to see. This came in the mid-1800s in Prussia. So now this is in a home territory. So now why are they bringing in now these two C's to a home territory and adding the age-segregated cohort? And the reason basically was to create a nationwide pipeline for military conscription, right? You've got this cohort coming in and going through the structured process and coming out at a predictable time after a predictable process that's now ready to go on to the next stage, and they've already learned obedience. So centralization, mass coordination, predictable cohorts, habituation to hierarchy and obedience, transformed learning into a regimented year-by-year progression, which mirrored and enculturated military drilling and bureaucratic ranking. By fixing children into unified batches, measuring them against identical timetables, and advancing them through a system designed for control rather than curiosity, the other thing that they did, if you look back at cards, is that they brought together those three C's of compulsion, competition, and age-based cohorts to complete the subsumption of infinite education into finite training, because you can no longer allow things like critical thinking and individual growth and innovation once you have this combination of the three C's. I now call this 3 cubed, and if you notice, a cube makes a box. This is when education got squashed into the box that we came to see as compulsory schooling. And it was designed to produce populations habituated to hierarchy, obedience, and performance-based valuation, turning school into the perfect tool to optimize a nation's capacity for war and colonial expansion. So then I had to test my hypothesis by having a look at the timeline. And I believe that this model is what made World War I logistically viable. We've got variations on C cubed in all of the Axis power home territories, Austria, Britain, and the USA, some of the first adopters. Now, what happened in World War II is people got to see this C cubed really in action. And they got to see how it could be used for extreme indoctrination and social control that would support even the most brutal of state objectives. And that horrific illustration of the heart of the C cubed model is what directly informed the drafting of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which is why it emphasized that education needs to aim for the full development of the human personality and respect for human rights in order to really be education. And ever since then, the United Nations has been trying to embed safeguards against indoctrination and exploitation into educational contexts, but unfortunately without spotting the foundations of the problem. So we keep trying to paste human rights on top of C-cubed models and looking for that to bring peace. And when learning, like religion, is treated as a finite game focused on grades, ranking, and obedience, its true purpose as an open, ongoing process of growth and discovery is lost. C-cubed turns the infinite game of education into a game of winning, stifling curiosity, creativity, and personal development. Now, all sorts of people have been pointing this out now for a number of decades. And Carter's warning about religious war makes it really clear why this matters. Because just as turning religion into ideology fosters conflict and domination, subsuming education into a finite competitive system of training produces populations conditioned to obey, accept hierarchy, and follow orders to the detriment of peace. And now we sit here in this world, and everybody is saying, why is fascism rising again? Why is fascism rising again? We've been putting the majority of the schooled kids in the world through C-cubed for multiple generations. Why is fascism rising again? And a culture of peace is what we need in order to keep it from collapsing into nothing but a training. So let's look now, instead of inculturation, what if we look at enculturation with an E and acculturation with an A? Because these are going to be our clues on how to turn this around. And school is the perfect place to do it. So first we have enculturation, which is simply learning your own culture. You learn your own community's language, customs, norms, values, traditions, and behaviors as you grow up. It's all around you. It's normal. It's the way the world is, and you learn it. And we can feel the difference between ourselves when we meet people from other cultures. They have got different languages, customs, norms, values, traditions, and behaviors. And we've all learned this completely naturally by being immersed in it. We didn't have to be coerced into it because it was all around us. Now comes acculturation, is what happens when you meet the people next door or across the border. So when individuals from different cultures come into contact, so the classic thing is an immigrant goes somewhere else, learns the new language, and adapts to the social customs of their new country. But at the same time, they're also sometimes, hopefully, introducing the people in that country to the customs and ideas that they've brought in with them that those people wouldn't encounter otherwise. So this cross-cultural pollination allows things like acculturation to begin. So we're enculturated to whatever surrounds us as we're growing up. But once we're immersed in a new culture, we can learn and adapt, even when we're not completely immersed, but we're just exposed to other ideas, values, traditions, and practices. Then we can experience a degree of acculturation. And this is becoming more and more possible because of the internet, right? We're finding out about things that we never knew existed, we could never have encountered. And many of us are becoming very inspired as we find out about other ways that people do things or have done things in the past. One ancient example, we can grind grain like this, or we can grind grain like this, right? You can see that these two would be considered different cultures. These people in this place do it like this. These people in that place do it like that. And then, of course, these people in that place do it like that. And there's so many. When I started looking at grain grinding, it's wonderful through history and geography how much, wow, humans are amazing, the things we come up with. But there's a discontinuity between these two and this one. Why? Because even though these are very different, here on the left in the green, these are very different ways of doing things, but they've got a common kind of meta culture behind them, which is, this would often be a communal activity. It's done with your own hands. You'd often have people gathering to do this together, doing it with work songs and rhythms and chants and chatter and gossip, right? So there were values of continuity, intimacy, and interdependence, and nourishment was part of family and ritual and ancestral knowledge. And what you were also learning at a meta level when you learned how to grind grain, you were learning the skill, but you were also learning patience and relationship with the earth. And the labor itself was an act of connection, linking you to the others in the community, linking you to your sense of cultural identity and sustenance in a cyclical, embodied way. And that's what they have in common, whatever they look like. Once we start doing things like this in history, and this also happens all over the world, but we start shifting that background, it starts shifting now because it's being centralized. People are bringing their grain to the mill, and only the miller can grind it. Very different value set here. So now we're talking about efficiency, and control becomes possible, and hierarchy can emerge. Who can afford to build a mill, right? And sustenance and production become separate, and food processing can now go into systems of power and commerce. You now have to pay the miller to get your corn ground. You can't do it yourself anymore. So things start to shift. Either way, this is still inculturation. Whichever one of these you grow up in is going to seem normal. If you're used to seeing it milled by the miller, it seems odd to you, the idea that you should have to grind it by hand. That's inculturation. Ultimately, we actually have a level of choice about what to align with and make our own. And this is the greatest principle of education, is not to be trapped as a slave to your origins, but to be able to actually have power to choose how you're going to live your life. So we really need children to have a lived experience of a culture of peace, because they're not really getting it in their wider world most of the time. So peace in the family is wonderful, but that's just the family. We need children to have the opportunity to live peace in a communal context so that we can all deeply understand in our bodies that it's possible, because otherwise domination and oppression just feel like reality, and we are not going to shift something if we don't believe it's possible. So this is also why the United Nations vision for education is so very, very clear on the fact that children should also learn about human rights by seeing human rights standards implemented in practice, at home, in school, within the community. And human rights education should be a comprehensive, lifelong process and start with the reflection of human rights values in the daily life and experiences of children. It's not going to help that much to take human rights and put it into C-cubed as a topic in the curriculum upon which you will be tested, in which you can fail, because that's not a lived experience of human rights. But when we create a culture of peace in our schools, then our children have the chance to inculturate differently and acculturate, because at the moment, I mean, if you just Google the word school and click images, and what you will see will be stuff like this, because the C-cubed model is now so normalized, it's become like the air we breathe. We can smell something stinky, but we don't realize what's causing it, because we're so used to this idea of this kind of paramilitary, industrial, standardized, controlled thing being school. Most of us are still under the illusion that it's perfectly realistic to nurture a culture of peace within C-cubed without addressing the impacts of C-cubed. It's much, much easier to achieve in non-C-cubed models. Much, much easier to achieve a culture of peace. Why is it so hard? Why is it not just straightforward? Let's drill down and look at the bullying and abuse that often takes place, both peer-to-peer and by educators. Why is it so hard to stop this in C-cubed context? For example, why is it so hard to get rid of corporal punishment, even in countries where it's been against the law for decades, like South Africa, been against the law for decades? It's still going on because violence is built into the core of the C-cubed model. The implicit values communicated when you coerce people to compete, their values of domination and oppression. And then all of the ages and roles in these environments can experience impacts to their well-being as a result. There's constant talk about how many teachers are leaving teaching because they can't take it anymore, because of the burnout, because of the stress, because of the abuse and what they're going through. Because this environment is not built for peace and it's not built for well-being. So there are many, many really good-hearted people working hard to bring peace and human rights and well-being into C-cubed places, but they often find that it's like pushing a rock uphill. Bullying is far less common, and well-being is more pervasive, and staff job satisfaction is far higher in agentic schools that don't align with C-cubed. So how can we achieve a culture of peace in school environments? What does that look like in practice? Well, you can replace compulsion with quality control, because educational offerings that truly meet children's needs do, in truth, in practice, I've seen it, they actively attract children, and then you don't need to force them because they want to do it, because they can feel this feels nourishing, this is expanding me, this is giving me opportunity to grow, and it fits my needs. You know, you don't need compulsion if you're doing that. You can replace competition with capacity building. So I'm not trying to grade you against your friend to see who wins. I am supporting you to see how are you doing? What do you need? Assessment is for the purpose of helping you identify your next best steps. Got nothing to do with beating your friends. And then age segregation can easily be replaced with egalitarian age mixing once you leave the C-cubed model. And you can replace that ageist domination with empowered agentic inclusion. So you'll find schools that are non-C-cubed already don't do any of this and haven't been doing any of this for decades. And you can see the outcomes and they're good. And it's a lovely place to work. That is the kind of environment where you really can realistically fulfill the human rights mandated aims of education, being the full development of the child's individual, unique personality, talents, and abilities, the development of respect for human rights and freedoms, because they've got a lived experience of respecting other people and being respected, development of respect for cultural identity, values, and the environment, because these things are no longer being shoved down your throat. They're being explored through open dialogue and direct experience, preparation for responsible life in a free society, and the development of a sense of dignity and the ability to participate effectively. I think the key is that we understand C-cubed and what it is and why it is, and then we can do what we are starting to do now. What does it do for humans of all ages with diverse needs when we take the C-cubed out of education? So I say humans of all ages because teachers who aren't bang in the middle of the normal curve are also going to struggle in a C-cubed system. If a teacher is quite sensitive or has, sort of sensory sensitivities or is prone to burnout, etc., they are also going to struggle. And those are often the best teachers, because the highly sensitive teacher is often the one who's most able to tune into the needs of the student. But they don't do well with that level of bureaucratic control and trying to deal with 40 children in a class. Are you kidding me? Not going to happen. Coercion and competitive standardization and age-pegged milestones actually do impact the majority of children in a negative way, because there's only a very small number, the so-called top few, who are in the middle of the normal curve, and they're a perfect fit for the system, and they can win. And that'll be your top 3 in the class. Who's top of the class? Who's second? Who's third? It'll be your straight A grade students, right? They're a minority who are actually going to thrive. Question about whether they're thriving because they're not getting the culture of peace. But they're going to be the winners in that finite game. And that's actually, of course, how the system was designed. It's meant to select a privileged few and train the rest to meekly accept their subservience. It's what it's built for. And then for those who are further out from the center, each one of those C's on its own is going to directly exclude and marginalize those outliers. So for example, autistic children with a pathological demand avoidance profile cannot do the thing exactly because it's coerced. If it wasn't coerced, they'd have a decent chance of doing it. A dyslexic child is often going to fall behind and start believing that they are stupid because of the cohorting thing, because often their brains are ready to deal with two-dimensional text a little bit later, not at 6. And if you look at the standardization, children whose strengths fall outside the curriculum are also going to start feeling stupid and marginalized because they don't excel in those things. They may excel in something that that particular school doesn't offer. Combine the three, and you see why so many children whose growth and learning doesn't lie in the center of the normal curve end up opting out, school refusal, being excluded, being expelled, or even being broken, which is why we have a disproportionate number of dyslexics in the prison system. So a true culture of peace is supportive and inclusive and empowering of everyone, regardless of diversity. It loves diversity. So a culture of peace and actual education are 100% aligned, because remember this rule of the finite and infinite game. The rules of an infinite game are changed to prevent anyone from winning or losing the game and to bring as many persons as possible into play. So in real education, in a culture of peace, we change the rules until we can meet the needs of every child who comes into our space. And that's the gold we're going to forge from the lead of the C-cubed system. This is where the proposal of the Rights-Centric Education Network comes in, that we propose to progressively overhaul all educational spaces and interactions to align with the evolution of human rights. All of them, because progressive overhaul means you don't require people to go from 0 to 100. That's not possible. You say, where are you right now? What are you doing well in your space? For example, some place that still uses corporal punishment is at least offering free education, whereas some amazing non-C-cubed school is very expensive and most children can't get in. So there's always something that you're doing well and something that you can improve on. What can you improve on first? Let's use human rights as a framework to help identify that goal, and step by step, one step at a time. So the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, or UNCRC, can actually become a checklist that we can translate into practical steps to gradually transform any educational space so that it becomes possible to nurture a culture of peace and to support true education in that space. There are two easiest concrete first steps for anyone, anywhere, in any educational environment that you can start on right now. The first one is take well-being seriously for everyone, because in the end, well-being and human rights are actually just different languages for the same thing. They're about human thriving individually and collectively. To take well-being seriously for everyone, you're going to start heading in the right direction. And number two, make sure everyone has a real voice. And this is also where participation in the decisions that affect them is central to all concepts of human rights and children's rights. So these two things, I suggest, are the gateway to everything else. Let's all do inculturation with a Y. Now you can guess Y stands for. The one thing I've really learned over the last 20 years is that the kids have a lot more to teach me than I have to teach them, especially when it comes to matters of peace and sustainability and having a future that they want to live in. So The moment that we bring those youth voices into a place where they can speak up safely and not in a token way, we can actually partner together to say, what shall we change first? What's your priority? Because for this school, it might be something simple like the kids say, we really hate the uniform. In that school, it might be, we really want to have a say in the curriculum because there's so many of us who want to do this other subject. For others, it might be, we really need to get rid of corporal punishment because it's just terrifying and traumatizing us and we can't even think how to learn, right? So the youth in each space have got the best idea of what it is for their needs to be met, and what we need to do is give their voices space, which is why I chose this slide for my background, because I see this as an adult with that big grindstone grinding the corn to get it done so we can all eat. But look at the two little stones next door, right? That's a little kid's one and a middle-sized kid's one, and they're allowed to help and they're included together. And this is a collaborative enterprise, and it doesn't matter who grinds how much or how fast or how well. It's the togetherness that we have, going back to those values of inclusion and sustainability. But together we can make something that is more nourishing for all of us.
What I see is that families, parents who are looking for schools for their children, for appropriate education, they are looking for that training rather than that education. So my question is that how, as educators, as advocates, as anything that we want to call ourselves, how we can inform families.
So these parents have been through C cubed themselves.
Mhm.
They have been inculturated into C cubed thinking. It's what they think is normal. It's what they experience as reality. It's what they think is education. And in that process, they have also lost some of their well-being, and they may or may not be conscious of that. The more that we can become literate in what actually is well-being made of. How do I know when my well-being is suffering or strong? How can I predict whether your well-being is doing okay? How can I see, why are you scared? What are you scared of? How do we communicate about that in a real way? Because I believe that those parents don't actually want C cubed. What they want is to know that their child is safe and is going to thrive. And they've been brought to believe that C cubed will bring safety and thriving. But what they really want is safety and thriving. So if you can engage with those parents around those needs that are underneath what they think they want, that's when you've got a chance to actually help them open up their awareness about how to achieve that safety and thriving for their kids. When we just tell people it's we do things differently here, or we have to do things differently because it's better, it doesn't really work. We need to give those parents space to express their fears, express their hopes, figure out what it is they're trying to achieve, and then support them in understanding how that's going to be achieved by what we're going to offer. So it's not a quick, easy process, but that's the point, right? Because training aims for a quick, easy, standardized process that we can bang out. We can say, this is how you get your parents on board, boom, boom, boom. That process itself needs to be one of peace. It needs to be one of authentic connection, communication, human belonging, and being able to actually have your well-being prioritized. So entering into those conversations is hugely important. And as you onboard more and more parents in that way, they won't be there because they've been sold something or they've been convinced of something. They'll be there because they've now started to experience something and embody something. And that builds a parent body that increasingly can welcome more and more parents into that community. which then also further builds that sense of safety and support and community that is really what everybody needs in order to thrive.
Hello, everyone. I think that this is an amazing presentation. Here I am, an African. Africa is among the most impacted by the C cubed.
Yeah.
We see the prevalence of war in Africa, poverty, low incomes in Africa, and all of this as a result of inculturation. Okay. And so this is difficult, and I wanted to see how deep have you thought of Africa as a special case in all of this?
Yeah, it's become the dominant culture. So it is now the inculturation. It's no longer even the inculturation. So yeah, I'm in Africa because I'm down in South Africa here. I don't know if you've had a look at what Kenya's doing, but I find that quite exciting, the sort of ethos that's busy emerging in Kenya. But what I'm seeing is I don't think in Africa it's going to be about collapsing the C cube, because you've also got this aspirational thing that happens when people have been denied access to education at all, and then they get sort of lured by this C cubed promise, then that's what they want. It's the same as, trying to do sustainability in communities that weren't allowed to own property or could never afford a car. It's like they want a Mercedes Benz. It's perfectly understandable. The problem that you have in my country where women don't want to breastfeed because now, formula feeding is more, sort of higher status, and they don't want to give natural birth because, we should all have the right to a C-section in a hospital. So you have that problem. But at the same time, we have a horrible opportunity, because when people are actually desperate to survive, they are more likely to come together if you can give them an opportunity to become empowered at a local level with their neighbors. Because firstly, they are unemployed, they don't have to go to work. And secondly, they are desperate enough to consider all options. So now, if you can pull people together in a community, and here I'd like to invite you to have a look at what India has done with the neighborocracy system. Because the neighborocracy system looks at pulling together people who live in close proximity to collaborate on solving their local problems together. And what they do is they also create children's parliaments, that they create 3 layers of neighborocracy. There's one for the adults, one for the teens, and one for the smaller kids. And they all start collaborating on what are our exact, immediate, most pressing problems, and how can we pull together to solve them. So the example I always love using is the one Indian village where there was, the way they organize it is they become ministers of agriculture and what, in their little neighborhood parliament. So the minister for economics identified a family who had no income, but they had a field behind the house. Then everybody chipped in for a loan to buy a milk cow for that family to put in the field. Then the family started selling milk to the neighbors who didn't have to walk 30 kilometers down the road to get fresh milk. And then they were able to pay back the loan from the proceeds of selling milk to their neighbors. So these kind of micro solutions that are not attractive to people who have a greater degree of wealth or access can actually be the foundation for something really quite empowering and actually very educational. Because the other thing is that we're seeing that neighborocracy system in India, it's now been going long enough that some of these young people have turned into really very empowered advocates and are going into government and, all of this sort of stuff. So we're looking really at complementing C cubed in Africa with grassroots, real education. So you get your education in spite of your schooling rather than relying on your schooling. Because as you say, even the good and the bad news is that C cubed isn't possible in Africa because we don't have the resources. tiny number of the population even has a textbook, right? But the advantage of that is it does mean that if you play your cards right, we can increasingly provide educational opportunity. And another thing I'd like to suggest you have a look at is the brand new Native Child of the World website, which I'm involved with, which is started by some San people here in South Africa, which is looking at using the internet to bring together wisdom keepers and Indigenous kids to be able to interface on the virtual level, to be able to actually start conserving some of those positive cultural practices that, as you say, are otherwise, some have already been lost, but there's still a lot, especially in terms of sustainable local agricultural practices and medicinal practices that can still be salvaged if we're quick. So I invite you to have a look at that and participate in helping that grow. But thank you for raising this because it's so important. And yeah, I always like to think Africa can end up leading the way, When I started on this journey 20 years ago, it was very, very hard to find anybody who was sort of on the same page or on the same journey or had the same wishes and dreams and ideals. We seemed to be so few. And as I moved forward, I started realizing that we are actually many. It's just that we don't know about each other. And now my life is this continual, it's like I cannot keep up. I cannot correspond with all these amazing people. It's incredible once you start diving through to realize how many of us are netted throughout the globe. It's just that more and more we need to be coming together so that we are coordinated and can inspire each other and not just keep reinventing the wheel. So that's also what we're trying to do now, because we are already doing it. It's not something we still have to begin.